The movie opens with someone injecting a substance into an egg yolk, and a similar and much younger egg yolk comes out of it. Elizabeth Sparkle, a celebrated Hollywood movie star, finally receives her star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a portent of things to come. A party is held to celebrate the occasion, and over the years, it has received much attention from the fans. But time passes, and her star begins to wane like Elizabeth herself. Elizabeth now hosts a long-running aerobics TV show titled Sparkle Your Life. Her performance is still as enthusiastic as ever, but once the camera is off, she rushes to catch her breath. In the hallway, people wish her a happy 50th birthday. Finding the women's restroom out of order, Elizabeth walks into the men's restroom and rushes inside a stall. Behind her, her producer Harvey barges in, angry on the phone with his agent. Harvey tells his agent to fire Elizabeth, since she's now old, and hire a younger woman for the role since he believes Elizabeth is past her prime. This devastates her. During a dinner with Harvey, Elizabeth is unceremoniously dismissed, as Harvey insists she lost something at 50. When Elizabeth inquires what, Harvey struggles with an answer and leaves the table. While driving home, Elizabeth is distracted by a billboard featuring herself being taken down, resulting in an accident. While at the hospital, the doctor says she has nothing to worry about since she has no injuries. Elizabeth begins to sob. Embarrassed, the doctor leaves. Before she can leave, however, a young male nurse sits her down for an additional checkup. He inspects her spine and remarks that she's a prime candidate, which surprises Elizabeth. He wishes her the best and allows her to leave. When she walks outside, she finds a flash drive advertising the substance inside her coat pocket and a number. Fred, a friend from school, finds her outside and remarks that she still looks just as beautiful as she was before. He tries to ask her out, and Elizabeth tells him to leave her with his number. The USB contains an advertisement for a serum that generates a younger, more beautiful, more perfect version of oneself. Elizabeth dumps the USB in the dustbin and proceeds with her day. After some deliberation, Elizabeth orders the substance and is only told to appear at an address before the person hangs the call. The following morning, Elizabeth prepares for her day and finds an announcement in the newspaper of a casting call seeking Elizabeth's replacement. Among her mail, she finds a package from the people behind the substance, with a card saying 503. Elizabeth proceeds to the address scribbled on her hand, which leads her to an unsuspecting ghetto with a suspicious shutter. She finds a card reader nearby and unlocks the shutter with her card, but it only opens so much, forcing Elizabeth to crawl inside into further darkness. A dark alley leads her to a futuristic locker room, and she opens her locker with her card. The locker contains a box. She takes the box home and opens it. It contains, among a set of instructions, a single-use activator serum, a stabilizer, a switch and food for Elizabeth, and the other self. At night, she injects herself with the serum and suddenly writhes and falls on the floor as her world begins to turn itself over its head. While she's struggling, a much younger version of herself emerges from a slit in her back. The younger Elizabeth admires her body in a state of shock and awe. Her real body, meanwhile, is still on the floor. Hastily, Elizabeth proceeds to stitch the slit in her back and injects her with the food matrix. In the morning, when her nose starts to bleed, Elizabeth rushes to inject herself with the stabilizer fluid extracted from the original body via a lumbar puncture to prevent deterioration. With everything in order, Elizabeth decides to invade the casting call to hire her own replacement. On the way, she decides on a fabulous pink swimwear and introduces herself to the casting agents as Sue. Harvey is infatuated by Sue and quickly hires her as Elizabeth's replacement. Sue tells Harvey to adjust a scheduling issue since she has to be out of town every next week to take care of her sick mother, a pretense to take the substance. Harvey has no issues with it. Her new TV show skyrockets her to fame, and Sue is the new celebrity. The substance establishes a symbiotic relationship between the two bodies. Elizabeth must transfer her consciousness between bodies every 7 days, with the inactive body remaining unconscious. The other self also requires daily injections of stabilizer fluid. Once the 7 days are over, Sue reluctantly returns to Elizabeth. Back in her body, she finally eats solid food and injects Sue with the food matrix. When Elizabeth returns to her office, she finds that all her portraits have been removed. An excited Harvey appears to return to Elizabeth all of her belongings from her previous office. While Sue is the star people expect to see now, she becomes an insecure recluse when living as Elizabeth. After a few days, Elizabeth receives her refill kit from the substance in the same locker room. Every day she is desperate to switch back to Sue. Once back as Sue, her real upbeat life begins. Sue decides to look for a hiding place to hide Elizabeth, eventually finding a weak wall in the bathroom. The noise of drilling alerts her neighbor Oliver, who angrily walks over to complain. But seeing a young and beautiful Sue takes him aback, and Oliver forgets his anger and even offers to help whenever. She hides Elizabeth's body behind the niche in the wall. Sue can eventually host her show, and now the hallway has Sue's picture. One night, Sue goes out to enjoy a confident, hedonistic lifestyle, while back home, Elizabeth runs out of her food matrix. After the party, Sue brings a date home, while Elizabeth chokes on her last bit of food matrix. Suddenly, her nose begins to bleed, and Sue rushes into the bathroom to see the situation. Not willing to keep her date on hold, Sue extracts extra stabilizer fluid from Elizabeth to extend the evening. The next morning, Elizabeth wakes to find her house in a state of disarray and a note from her date. As she lifts her hand to remove it, she discovers that her index finger has aged more rapidly. She tries to clean it, but water cannot wash away the age, and there is a bump in her back from the extra injection. She calls the supplier, who warns that staying as Sue longer than 7 days causes irreversible rapid aging of her original self, and Elizabeth must follow the switching schedule to prevent this from happening again. Though Elizabeth suspiciously says that she did not know what Sue was thinking, the supplier reminds her that they are one. Furious, she tries to divert her mind by vacuuming, but Sue's show appears on the television, and the youthfulness of her own self makes Elizabeth jealous. A knock on the door surprises her. Oliver just saw Sue's show and wants to invite her for a drink tonight. Elizabeth goes to retrieve her refill kit with her aged hand gloved. Suddenly, noises alarm her, and Elizabeth rushes to the comfort of a diner in a state of paranoia. Inside, an old man remarks how the 7-day waiting period feels very long. He drops his wallet, and Elizabeth notices his card and the scar on his back, and recognizes him as the young nurse who introduced her to the substance. The old man reminds Elizabeth that her old self is also worth living for, and asks if Sue has started eating away at her. Paranoid, Elizabeth runs and bumps into her date from last night, who cannot remember her now. She rushes home and calls Fred, recalling that he still saw her as beautiful. She prepares a dress for the date, being mindful to keep her hands gloved. However, one look at Sue reminds her of her own inadequacies, and Elizabeth tries to cover them with makeup. But before leaving, she sees an ad of Sue on the billboard and realizes that she still cannot compete with her. She returns to cover her skin and races against time. However, before she can leave, Sue gazes back at her, a reminder of the youth she's lost with time. She decides that no amount of makeup is enough, and she ultimately decides not to go, leaving Fred hanging. When she returns as Sue, her show resumes. While dancing, Sue is distracted when she feels a bump appear on her hip. As the camera cuts, the crew receives a call from the management saying they saw something strange in camera 2, which was focused on Sue's hip. They decide to dissect it frame by frame. Terrified, Sue rushes into the locker room to remove the bump, which is revealed to be a leg piece. Sue awakens from this nightmare next to Elizabeth. She rushes outside and is disgusted by what she sees. Despite being a single consciousness, both personas begin viewing themselves as separate individuals and quickly grow to despise each other. Elizabeth becomes jealous of Sue's beauty and success and resents the latter's frequent disregard of the switching schedule, whereas Sue is appalled by Elizabeth's constant self-loathing and binge eating. She calls her supplier, furious that the balance is not working. The supplier reminds her that there is only one of her. When Sue returns to her show, she's informed that her show is canceled, and Harvey wants to see her immediately. Anxious, she goes to Harvey's office and is informed that she has been selected to host the broadcaster's major New Year's show, the network's biggest show with 50 million viewers. As Sue's popularity skyrockets, she refuses to change back to Elizabeth, depleting her body of the stabilizer and taking more days to herself. When Elizabeth finally returns, she is horrified to see that she's aged considerably more. She calls her supplier and says Sue is not respecting the balance. But the supplier reminds her that it's just her and that she can always stop taking the substance. Seeing how she lost so much, Elizabeth decides not to stop the substance. Elizabeth now finds it a struggle to perform her routine tasks with her old body. To occupy herself, she decides to learn how to cook French cuisine. When Sue appears on a TV show, Elizabeth watches as though she is watching a foreign person. Even Sue acts as though Elizabeth is another person. And when the host asks if Sue is a fan of Elizabeth, Sue says she finds Elizabeth to be old-fashioned. Elizabeth's mind begins to deteriorate, and she covers all of her windows and reminders of Sue. When Sue wakes up, she is disgusted to see what has become of the house. Furious, she pulls out bottles of stabilizer fluid from her body in order to avoid seeing her again, as she refuses to switch back, deciding to remain as the other self permanently. 3 months later, on the day of a New Year's telecast, Sue finds Elizabeth's body completely depleted of stabilizer fluid. When her mind begins to break apart, Sue calls the supplier, who informs her that the only way to replenish the fluid is by switching back to her original self. With her show about to happen, Sue cannot risk it, but the state of her body leaves her no other choice than to switch. Sue's date is alerted by the noise she's making and comes out to investigate, but Elizabeth closes the door on him. When she looks into the mirror, Elizabeth finds herself horrifically transformed, now a near hairless and deformed hunchback. She scares the date and calls the supplier, begging him to stop. They deliver her the final kit, and Elizabeth rushes to retrieve it, even in the state she is in. The kit contains a serum designed to terminate Sue. She pulls Sue's body out and prepares to inject her. However, voices in Elizabeth's head warn her against it. Still desperate to stop Sue's stabilizer abuse from further degrading her body, she injects Sue with the syringe. But before she can inject the full syringe of termination serum, still craving admiration, Elizabeth stops and proceeds to resuscitate Sue, even offering her own blood. This disrupts their symbiotic balance and leaves both fully conscious. Realizing Elizabeth's intent upon seeing the near-empty syringe of termination serum, Sue is filled with rage and proceeds to attack Elizabeth. The older Elizabeth can only fight back and locks herself in the bathroom. Sue breaks open the door and murders her by smashing her face into a mirror, stomping and kicking her before leaving to host the New Year's special. Without Elizabeth, however, Sue's body begins to rapidly deteriorate. Though she tries to survive through the show, Sue's teeth begin to fall off. She suddenly remembers that some leftover activator serum is back at her home and rushes to retrieve it. On the way, she's surprised by Harvey and the shareholders, who ask her to smile. Sue smiles, but without showing her teeth. In a panic, Sue rushes to her apartment, and on the way, even her nail and an ear fall off. She finds the activator serum, though it contains a warning that the activator is single-use only and should be discarded. Still, she injects herself, and this inadvertently creates Monstro Elizabeth, a grotesque hybrid of the two forms. However, she wears her dress and goes to the live broadcast wearing an improvised Elizabeth Sparkle mask. When the show begins, everyone is shocked by what they're seeing, but as she starts to speak to the audience, the mask falls off. The horrified audience erupts into violent chaos. A man decapitates Elisa Shue, and a stump on her body sprays and drenches the audience with blood as more faces begin to appear from the decapitated head. What is left of Elisa Shue escapes the studio and collapses into viscera. Elizabeth's original face emerges, crawls onto her neglected star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, gazes at the stars, smiles, and melts. The bloody remains are cleaned up by a floor scrubber the next day, and the movie ends.